Kinders, kaum zu glauben, aber jetzt startet schon das Abschlusspanel von Tag 1. Kleiner Spoiler, es wird um Widerstand gehen. Worum genau, das erfahrt ihr gleich. Und nach dem Panel ab 19 Uhr dann die richtig nice Abendshow. Ich weiß ganz genau, ein paar von euch Pappenheimer sind doch nur wegen der Party da. Dazu dann gleich mehr. Und jetzt kommt Dr. Noa H. mit ihrem Panel und ein paar Infos, ein bisschen Highlighten zu Noa H. Sie lehrte und forschte an Hochschulen in Berlin und Dresden und ist derzeit kommissarische wissenschaftliche Geschäftsführerin am Deutschen Zentrum für Integrations- und Migrationsforschung. Ihre Forschungsfelder sind, ich kann die gar nicht alle aufzählen, aber 3 davon, und zwar kritische Integrationsforschung, postkoloniale Stadtforschung,
Postcolonial Urban Studies and postcolonial critique.
Ab Oktober ist sie an der
From October on, she will be at the Art School of Weißensee. Maybe I'll go there.
Mit Dr. Noa H.
This is Dr. Noa H. Give her a warm welcome.
Ja, hallo, danke Tarek, danke für die...
So yeah, thank you Tarek, thank you so much for the welcoming and the introduction. Hello to you guys out there in the internet.
Herzlich willkommen zu diesem letzten
Welcome to this last panel for today. I will switch to English now, because we were asked to manage 3 languages on this panel for transnational resistance and dialogue. I will switch to English, in fact. We're talking about different forms of resistance. I'm sorry. We will talk about solidarity, resistance against racism, colonialism in different transnational settings. So I'm very, very happy to introduce you guys.
Because we had no idea that the whole panel will set up as a TV production. So we're sitting here, we have no idea what you see. And it seems that we lost one of our panelists, but I will introduce all of the panelists because they're all present here in Berlin, in New Zealand and France. So I will start with Tina Gatta, who is online. We can see her here on the screen. She's an independent researcher and author. She's a Gatipuru mother of 2 from the east coast of Te Ika a Maui. Her work involves advocacy for environmental, indigenous and human rights. This includes local, national and international initiatives that highlight the role of settler colonialism in issues such as climate change and waste pollution, and promote indigenous conservation as best practice for a globally sustainable future. A warm welcome to you, Tina. So we don't have an applaud at the moment. The next person I will present, who won't participate to the discussion due to technical problems, is Fatma Chingi Koca Dost. She's a researcher, political activist, the Groupe d'études Transglobal. She's a researcher and activist. She received her doctorate in sociology from the Esajas and the University of Lausanne. Her thesis focuses on the reconfiguration of gender, class and race dominations in contemporary France. Since her migration to France in 2003, she has initiated various feminist, queer, anti-racist and decolonial collectives, seeking to build links in a transnational space between France and Turkey, as well as within the Turkish and Kurdish diaspora in Europe. So it's really a pity to have not her within this discussion. But we hope to get some inspiration already out of presenting her. Then I'm happy to introduce our guest who came from the Netherlands, Michel Asayas, who is co-founding director of the Black Archives. And he's co-founder of New Urban Collective, a network for students and young professionals from diverse backgrounds with a focus on the Surinamese, Caribbean and African diaspora. He's a social entrepreneur and involved in various community projects in the areas of education, employment, diversity and sustainability. Michel studied business studies and anthropology at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. In 2016, he co-founded the Black Archives in Amsterdam, a unique collection of books, documents, and artifacts documenting the history of Black people and Black resistance in the Dutch context. Based on the collection, they developed work with artists, activists, and scholars to develop exhibitions and other public activities. In 2018, they won the Amsterdam Art Prize. So congratulations to this.
Thank you.
Very welcome here. And then I'm happy to introduce Mahmud Muhammad, our fourth panelist here. He's the director of LAMSA. I will introduce him in English. He will talk in German, and we might switch meanwhile from German to English. We have to figure it out how we do it here. Mahmud Muhammad is born in Syria, graduate social pedagogy, founding member, and since 2015 the managing director of the Landesnetzwerk Migrantenorganisationen in Sachsen-Anhalt, a federal network of migrant organizations in Sachsen-Anhalt. Currently, about 107 organizations and individuals are members of LAMSA. And he's also a member of the Saxony-Anhalt State Integration Advisory Board, the Saxony-Anhalt State Youth Assistance Committee, the Saxony-Anhalt Media Authority, and the Demography Advisory Board. So you're influencing politics in Saxony-Anhalt.
Yes.
The focus of his work is the voluntary commitment and participation of migrant organizations, as well as structural support of the municipal levy. A warm welcome to you. I'm very happy to have him here because we met several years ago, in particular about migrant politics in East Germany. So from presenting to you all the guests here, we see that we are spanning different variations of colonialism, different states of society. So the first question I have to all of you, just to start to give you an impression of where you are and what you're doing, because we want to talk about resistance, but I think to organize resistance, the question of solidarity is of such a huge importance. So please, Tina, I know it's very early for you, but first of all, I want to pose you the question, what means solidarity in your context, and how do you mobilize solidarity?
Oh, kia ora. Oh, good, you can hear me. I guess for my context, just to outline my context first, as you heard, I'm a Ngata Koroe woman. We're very isolated, remote isolated on the East Cape of Te Ika Maui, also called the North Island of Aotearoa. We face many of the same challenges faced Indigenous groups, particularly isolated Indigenous groups all around the world, and in the Pacific region, that being climate change, has a huge impact for us because we are coastal peoples, and actually I'm in the middle of a massive severe storm at the moment, hoping it won't take out our internet while I talk to you. So issues like climate change are very direct and immediate for us. It's not an issue that we're facing in the future, and that's one of the, along with some of the oceanic pollutions and challenges that are associated with climate change and plastic pollution. We experience much of the same kind of oppressive power relationships that sit around water allocation and natural resources here. But all of that sits within this kind of broader experience of colonialism and imperialism, whether it exists in the space of power relations or economic drivers to a lot of these issues. And I think it's that the transnational nature of the problem that actually also informs some of our solidarity methods. And so for me, a big part of my work is supporting anti-colonial research and anti-colonial conservation projects that work to centre Indigenous ways of knowing and being and doing, but also actively, proactively take on the issues of colonialism and imperialism. And the spaces that I've found most helpful for building solidarity in that sense is talking with our other groups around how what we experience is connected to what they experience. So, for instance, with our migrant whānau who have come here from, for instance, West Africa, we engage in programs where we learn about the issues of the doctrine of discovery and how that impacted upon West and continues to impact upon their nations, but also where we sit in relation to each other. And it doesn't take long for us to find out that we're actually very close in that story, and we're not as diverse or as different as what we knew. So learning about those relationships through the broader story of imperialism and colonization at a global scale, so that we can kind of geolocate ourselves and our struggles and understand our relationships and respect each other's and be allies to each other, whilst also understanding our boundaries and our differences so that we don't overstep in that allyship and recognize each other's distinctiveness. And recognizing distinctiveness is a huge, what I've found in my experience is a huge part of being able to be a good ally, is knowing where those boundaries are as well. So I guess that's some of the things that I would initially think about that helps to build solidarity.
Thank you. Thank you for alluding to what you understand as solidarity. And what actually is striking to me that you were talking about the conversation you're having with migrant farmers, it sounds like you're mobilizing indigenous diasporic knowledge there where you are. So this is, I think, perhaps this might happen also to different situations. I would pass the question now to how you organize solidarity to you, Michelle. In the introduction, the transnational scope was visible, and so what does it mean for your work in your context?
Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation and this very interesting digital transnational connection. Yeah, besides the introduction that you gave about my work at the New Urban Collective and the Black Archives in terms of solidarity and resistance, another part of my work is focused on grassroots activism. Over the past, say, 10 years, I've been involved in organizing and mobilizing people, especially in the Netherlands, against racism, which is also a legacy of the colonial history and the history of imperialism in the Dutch context, especially focused on a very particular national tradition. As the most popular tradition in the Netherlands, which includes this blackface figure. And what we've been trying to do is use that as a catalyst to create more awareness and policy change around issues of race in the Dutch context. And in terms of international solidarity, what we've done is that we've been trying to build links with other grassroots organizations, especially in Europe, but also in Suriname, former Dutch colony, Curaçao, former Dutch colony in the Caribbean, the United States, to show that this legacy of colonialism and imperialism is not just a Dutch problem, but it's an international problem. And we've been able to build these connections, which have been very helpful. Even here in Berlin, we've had people organizing solidarity, a protest over the past few years. And we've really seen how that helped us to change the discourse, the narrative in the Dutch context, because they often try to limit it to, a national issue, whilst it's a transnational problem. So there's just one of the examples, practical examples, how we try to build transnational solidarity. One other example, I think, would be the Black Lives Matter movement, especially last year. That has been a very large moment, starting with the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other African Americans. And we saw that across the world, people yeah, we're mobilized to show support. And I think one of the reasons why millions of people across the world, including Amsterdam, join these protests is because it's a transnational problem. And the same issue of racial profiling, police violence, based on a long history of white supremacy, which we see in the US, is what we see here in Europe. So yeah, we organized protests in the Netherlands as well. It was the first time that more than 50,000 people joined protests across the whole country. And yeah, we're still building on that movement that we've built over the past 10 years. And I'm happy to be here to continue the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So what I heard as well, that in particular the transnational and international perspective is important to empower yourself and strengthen the discourse, and also perhaps also in changing the discourse.
Absolutely.
Very good. Mohamad, ich werde jetzt ins Deutsche wechseln. Ich weiß nicht, was die Übersetzung jetzt gerade damit macht. Aber die Frage an dich, was bedeutet für dich Solidarität in
Change to English to German now. So what does it mean for you in Saxony to actually
Solidarität, gerade auch mit Blick nochmal auf Ostdeutschland, wo auch die Kontexte nochmal anders sind als
so especially in the terms of like East Germany, which is quite different to West Germany. What does it mean for your actual contemporary work? Thanks so much for the invitation. So I think if you look at the structures of an organization like LAMSA, it's a migrant organization that spans through different ethnicities. The people that come there come from different countries. They come with their sorrows, they come with their experiences, they come with their experience of resistance also. And that, of course, adds to a structure such as LAMSA. From the very beginning, this was very important to us, and there's quite a few of us in East Germany, so that means we need to build collectively in order to bring our interests out there. The experiences we made in the past 12 years is being there for each other, listening to each other, going into the streets with each other, and that's pretty much what makes us. I think that's interesting because the experiences that people make are quite similar. For example, how do I handle crisis? How do I live resistance? That's a daily experience. Also related to the current situation in Afghanistan, with a few people that are connected to each other and that can think about how can we actually support our colleagues. There's another question that I would like to add, because you formulated it like this. You said we work together, and who is the we that you talk about, especially looking towards the crisis, talking about Afghanistan? There are many crises, especially in the diasporic communities. Who is the we for you and your work and to build it? So it's quite simple. If people tell me how they feel at the moment, how they are, for example, relating to Afghanistan, then the experience, of course, comes up related to what happened in Syria. I can follow. I can relate to the emotion. I can relate to the feeling of helplessness. We understand each other in this way. The empathy is also a form of solidarity, being together, thinking about struggles together, giving each other power. This is a form of collectivity, of being there for one another. These people trust each other, these people know themselves through mutual experiences that they've made together. So the next question I would ask in both directions.
Fantastic opportunity. On one hand, Tina, she is speaking representing a perspective from a settler colonial perspective in a settler colonial context, and then we have Michelle here, who has also addressed colonialism and imperialism. But I also think there is a difference in regard to colonialism in Europe. I always call it metropolitan colonialism. And so I'm interested into what Tina said in the beginning on the, I don't know if you said if it's a challenge, but recognizing distinctiveness, what that means in terms as an anti-racist struggle, because you are
Correct.
in many ways addressed in a specific ways, and then how to gain ownership in terms of self-description. I mean, you were referring also to the Black Lives Matter movement and addressing and owning blackness. That is one strategy. So I'm interested in both of your experiences, but also a bit reflecting how colonialism plays into it, or racism then as such. Tina, please start.
Sure. So I think education, first and foremost, is a really important, foundational block for this. And I think the Black Lives Matter movement is an excellent example for us. But similarly, if we go back to the 60s and 70s, the civil rights movement also made ripples around the world, and those ripples landed on the shores here of Aotearoa, New Zealand as well, and inspired land marches and language marches for Maori rights here. Similarly, we saw the Black Lives Matter movement arrive here, and there were huge marches. Tens of thousands of people in our capital cities came out to march, and this is wonderful, but we also need to be mindful to not co-opt the Black Lives Matter movement as our own without recognizing and respecting the distinctiveness of that experience. It's also important for us to understand, and this is probably good practice anyway, but it's an instinctive Māori practice, is to understand the philosophical genealogy of anything, of everything that you're dealing with, because genealogy is everything to us. So we need to understand the philosophical genealogy of, for instance, the Black Lives Matter movement and the entire story of that. Now, not many, unless you're proactive around that education, because it doesn't sit in colonial models of education, it's always centered around the white people in the story, the Europeans in the story. So if we actually put them out of the room and tell a story about what has happened in the Pacific, what has happened for Maori people, and how does that relate to what's happening to Black Americans protesting in the streets, and where do our stories come together over history, and where do they diverge? And so things like, we have the Ku Klux Klan here in Aotearoa, we had a slave trade in the Pacific as well. The N-word came over in a movie that was made by white supremacists in the United States in the early parts of the 20th century, and that was co-opted into our society and used against Maori people as well. And so there's all of these really interesting ways in which our stories come together. But if we don't recognize that, then what happens is that it becomes a little bit of a thematic performative exercise where we go on the march and we raise our fists, but we're not functionally there for the movement. And the movement cannot functionally be there for us either, unless we are educated around how we relate to each other within the context of those movements. And that is also the same for migrant refugee rights, for border issues. All of these issues is just understanding where we sit in relation to each other with it, so that we don't inadvertently co-opt each other's struggles and can be solid for each other.
Thank you very much, Tina. Michelle, what are your thoughts on the question?
Yeah, definitely agree on what you said, Tina. Thank you for your comments, especially the idea of the genealogy of these movements. Indeed, what you said, what you often see happening, often also from well-intended people, is that they tend to co-opt movements which garner a lot of attention and then center themselves in the struggle, which actually should be about, the people, what it's about. So I think a very essential principle in solidarity, both locally, nationally, and definitely transnationally, is to always, center the people who are the center or the topic of the movement. So that's what I indeed saw a lot with the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of performative activism, people posting black boxes on social media, and white people taking a lot of space at these protests. But in terms of the relation between being in what you could say the colonial metropole, Europe, Amsterdam, Berlin now, vis-a-vis the settler colonial state, I think we, as let me speak for myself, as a black person, cis, hetero, black person living in Amsterdam, living in Europe, have to recognize, or we have to think about our position within this, global structure. Because on the one hand, we kind of benefit and may even perpetuate certain structures of oppression. But on the other hand, we may also suffer from these same structures. So I think, it's very important to think about your positionality and see how, I think it's also responsibility when you're at the center, how you can contribute both locally and transnationally to, creating a fair awareness and fighting against these systems of oppression. And to give one concrete example, we have a Surinamese background. Suriname used to be a Dutch colony. There's a large Surinamese community in the Netherlands. And the legacy of colonialism obviously is very different in Suriname. So for example, what we see there is that indigenous people from Suriname, which is north of Brazil, South America, still suffer from, that their land has been taken away. Now you see a lot of corporations polluting the environment. So for us as people in the colonial metropole, I think we have a responsibility to fight against these structures like Shell or policies of the government which perpetuate these problems, and in a way that it centers their voice. So, we try to listen to the problems there, see how we can amplify their voices and problems. And it's a challenge, but I think that's a very important thing to try to do.
Actually, somehow you did already answer the question I had when I was listening to Tina, and also Tina, she started also talking about climate change, that this is now very much at stake. Just right now in the situation, as you said, you don't know where the storm is going and whether we can have you still, the internet might go. And I was wondering how climate change is part of your specific struggles. And this question I also, and you gave already some answer, and now I switch back to German because we do speak German. Mahmud, die Frage an dich, inwiefern auch diese globalen Herausforderungen einerseits mit Blick auch auf die
So the global challenges in terms of like war, in terms of flight, but also in terms of climate change. How is this relevant for your work? Let's reflect on this in this transnational round if possible. Yeah, so the people come from different contexts here to Germany. In Saxony-Anhalt, it's no different. The socio-demographic fractions, both before East Germany fell to West Germany and after, we had the so-called Vertragsworkers, contract workers, in comparison to the so-called Gastarbeiter in West Germany. So there is a history of migration in both Germanys. And people simply have different reasons to come. Climate change will become a more relevant problem in the future than in the past. But if it's not possible to live where people live, like literally not possible, it is important to grant people the right to live here and to reflect. It's not so much about why is this person here in terms of like reflecting, but how can we work together towards a goal? If we're talking education, if we're talking racism, if we're talking inequality just in daily life, for example, the work market. And what we see time over and over again, what always stays with us in a way is like this idea of what rights do minorities have? What rights have been granted to minorities? Even if it's just a small group, it doesn't really matter. Because I feel like in a democracy, it needs to be possible that minorities are able to form their right to their own opinions, their own demands. And me now looking through this conversation, what needs to be learned is that if we work through these things in Germany, is that we can learn from other people. And the processes of these like discussions, conversations, and exchanges in terms of like self-determination, for example, they take years. This takes time. It's not easy to bring people together, to have these conversations, to start them. But at the end of the day, they are fruitful because the question of solidarity and the question of what actually unites us should be and is front center.
I switched to English, but I will take up something you said about the learning. And I was also thinking about how the question of education matters, as I would also now move from the question of solidarity to the question of resistance. How does education, either in the colonial setting, is a challenge to resistance on one hand, but what are the tools or strategies, whatever? I mean, the Black Archive is as well, I think, like an educational environment. So there are strategies to invent, develop, and create new strategies of education. So to Michelle and Tina, how does education play a role in creating resistance? Perhaps you can start, Michelle.
Sure. Yeah, maybe I can say a little about the Black Archives, how it arose in relation to, the resistance. So as I said, we started as a student union actually, focus on students of color and black students because we found that there was a lack of attention being given to critical and decolonial black perspectives. So we started organizing on the university, but also outside of the university. And yeah, we saw that it attracted a lot of people because a lot of people noticed, felt that in the school system, people are being taught from a very Eurocentric point of view. So we started organizing, and yeah, a huge collection was donated by a sociologist from Suriname who passed away. And yeah, to make a long story short, different donations were given, and we ended up finding a fascinating silenced history of black presence and black resistance in the Netherlands. Because what often happens is that in the Netherlands, I think broader in Europe, people learn a lot about, for example, what Tina mentioned, the civil rights movement. People know Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Black Lives Matter, but they don't learn about even their own history of resistance. So what we try to do is show that even in our own country and own city, we have a long history of resistance, which also includes transnational solidarity. We found a fascinating example, for example, of the first black communist in the United States who was from Suriname in the 1920s, but also traveled to Hamburg, South Africa, the United States. So by making that erased history visible, we also challenge this dominant Eurocentric, white supremacist view and perspective, and that can fuel different forms of resistance. So yeah, we really use the archive as a tool to educate people politically, socially, culturally, and yeah, it's in that sense it's tied to the social movement.
I would like to add another question, because as you say, so many new, like you also reveal so many new histories, and it's becoming more important. And to make the question a bit bigger, like you started as an initiative, but you think a new educative or a new system of education is needed?
Absolutely. I mean, I've worked at the university for a while as a student advisor, and there was actually a movement, there was occupation of the university, in which there was a lot of solidarity between white and black and students of color and indigenous students, well, the few of them. But what I noticed was that, you know, it was very difficult to create or simulate structural change within the university. So I think there's a lot of interesting decolonial theory. One of the concepts they use is delinking. So instead of trying to change things within, you can create alternatives outside of the existing system. So yeah, we set up our own archive as a grassroots initiative. And what's interesting is that throughout the years, we've been existing for 5 to 6 years now, is that by creating the alternative, you show how it can be done in a different way. And indirectly, we still have an impact on these existing institutions. So I believe in, you know, a both and strategy. There should be people within the university, people like ourselves, but at the same time, there should also be alternatives being developed outside of these existing structures, and yeah, they can feed each other.
Yeah, thank you. I see also Tina, she is nodding a lot, and before I give you the word, I got a card which is saying that to everybody out there who wants to pose a question, it's possible to send questions with the number and the message to the email address, which you will see, but I can't see, but you will see it on the screen. So this is also an information. So if you want to engage in our conversation we are having here on stage in this hybrid setting and transnational perspective, you can come in and pose your question. I will receive probably more of these cards, and then I can pose it to our guests here. And so make use of the information you receive on screen. So I'm happy to ask now, Tina, what is this, how you use education, or how does education plays a role in resistance, in your active processes of resistance?
Yeah, sure. So just, absolutely agree with everything that Michelle was just saying as well. And just recognizing that academia and many of the current education systems also have their roots in the same kind of imperialist background, and they're also struggling to decolonize and de-imperialize themselves at a systemic level, and they play significant roles within the power structures that need to be dismantled. And like many power structures, they have self-interest at the heart and preservation of those power systems at their heart. And so you're always going to be coming up against that that instinct of self-preservation and self-interest as you're going about the journey of dismantling the legacy of racism and imperialism as it sits within these education spaces as well. And that is something that needs to happen. At the same time, I absolutely agree. We also need to build alternative models, standalone models, because otherwise you will only ever be dancing to the beat of somebody else's drum, as we say. So, you know, you need to try and build these models that allow you to express yourself and live your resistance as you envision it to be. The other thing that I would say is that we need to teach about power a lot more. And so there are some things that are very deliberately not taught about. You know, they deliberately don't teach about the colonial invasions, and they deliberately call them these innocuous terms like the land wars, but they were actually colonial invasions here in Aotearoa. And so there's a lot of those things around the current education that needs to be flipped and needs an anti-colonial lens placed on it so that we understand our own histories from an anti-colonial perspective. At the same time as we re-indigenize. Re-indigenizing for us, re-indigenizing is a process where I'm completely centering myself and surrounding myself in what it is to express and live and breathe and do and think as an Indigenous person. Anti-colonial work really looks at dismantling and calling out the harms of the colonial system as it exists in science, as it exists in the economy, as it exists in education. And so those are things that need to happen in tandem. And I kind of hear, you know, an interesting reflection in what Michelle is proposing as well, but just from a slightly different perspective there. And then the other thing that I would say is that particularly for transnational spaces, and this is particularly pertinent also for issues like climate change, is that we need to learn about the role of transnational institutions like the Bretton Woods institutions, and how those have connected into the story of imperialism, how that has impacted all of our different experiences and continues to today. So we must learn about the history of it, but also learn how it's still operating today. And when we have those backgrounds and understandings to our economic situation today, the economic injustice that we face, the political injustice that we face, we're much better equipped to be able to navigate our way towards justice.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you so much for your thoughts.
So thank you so much, Tina. Thank you for your thoughts.
I got the translation thing. I was a little bit irritated. Mohamad, auch an dich die Frage, inwiefern Bildung, Erziehung, nicht
So the question also for you,
Bildung,
the idea of education.
im Widerstand spielt.
What do you think, what role does it play in terms of like resistance? Sure, yeah. I think it plays a big role. The experiences in resistance is actually quite interesting. Which universes do they arrive in? How does collective history, collective memory, what role does it play? What do I bring with me? If people have been in resistance for like generations in terms of like their parents and their grandparents, they have this great collective memory. And I think it's super interesting to look at that, how they approach this.
Man sieht einen Menschen, die eine gewissermaßen dieses Widerstand im Blut.
It's so crazy. Sometimes you see people and you can basically see the resistance in their blood, which they have inherited.
Klarheit, wenn Positionen da sie auch klar sind, einfach was sie wollen, was sie möchten.
People who are very clear about their positions in terms of like what they want and the types of experiences that they've had with certain forms of resistance. Political education is also very important. For example, next week, there has been some organizing happening on Tuesday from the Afghan community who want to raise awareness for the situation. At the same time, they're really afraid for things to escalate. Because the different positionalities that people bring with themselves have not yet been talked about. Who comes? What kind of escalation? Well, actually, also amongst each other, just like coming into a space together where there has been no negotiating been taking place yet. In Afghanistan, things happened really quickly. The Taliban have come to power fast, kind of like overnight it feels. Nobody was, it seems, really prepared. And the people in Germany were also not prepared to like see, okay, what does this mean for me? So the Americans are gone, this is not fine, Taliban is here now. So this is a situation where people amongst themselves have to see what positions do we have if we speak to the public, if we go outside, if we externalize, and therefore we need political education for people to be able to connect their processes and their working together. So escalations can kind of be avoided. The most important thing that I would say in terms of the resistance, if you go to the street, the formats you find, of course, relate to the type of education that one also receives or has access to. So you definitely need a space where people can organize. They also need safe spaces or safer spaces to organize, but at the same time, it is really important that we protect people who engage politically. And for many people, it's a vulnerable spot in Germany if they say, if I'm politically engaging in something, people will attack me. So people that do it need to be protected. Thank you. So the political education that you talk about, you think about this in terms of like within the communities for each other to even be able to create resistance? Yeah, totally. And that people actually have safer spaces to think about how they want to approach the public and approach the outside world.
Okay, I just got a card with various questions from our audience, so I'm going to read them real quick and see which questions to ask.
I will start with the first question, and
I'll start with
to
the
all of you, and I'm very curious to learn from you. Because it's actually a question addressing the situation we're right now, because we're working and organizing and sitting here live on stage, but not in a hall with hundreds of other people who actually every year meet here for this conference, and which is a huge pity because actually it's one of the most important events in the year. So we are here in this situation, and the question I have here, how has the pandemic changed your work, especially with regards to transnational connections? And we see how fragile it is to set up these connections. Actually, we wanted to have Fatma in our conversation, but it wasn't possible due to technological issues. But on the other hand, it makes it a little bit easier. So, Tina, the question goes to you first.
Sure.
What you want to say about the pandemic in a transnational scope, but also I think in the scope where you're working at. How had the pandemic affected your work or changed?
Well, I think there's a couple of different ways in which it's been impacted. One that I would say, like for instance, there's some positive impacts for us insofar as we've had to mobilize. We're just now coming out of a very severe, we do lockdowns. I don't know if you've heard, but we do lockdowns pretty full on here in New Zealand, Aotearoa, and like people really can't leave their homes unless they have very, very good reasons. So we're just coming out of that right now. And what I would say is that it's actually really inspired me to see how well equipped our people are, and I've seen it in other nations as well, particularly in an indigenous space, of thinking about collective well-being and thinking about the collective, thinking about the greater and looking at the bigger picture of things and being able to mobilize on the ground with the thought of the collective in mind. And so for us here in a very remote, isolated situation, we've had to think of very innovative ways to provide for our people in need, to lock down travel into our region because a lot of tourists used to like coming here as well. Some of that has been at the risk of arrest because the Crown would not send us resources, and at the same time the Crown was about to arrest us for breaking lockdown, for closing down travel as well. And so but it's also brought a greater sense of kind of internal solidarity with each other, because colonization had kind of started to really wreak havoc in our space of cohesion, community cohesion, and especially mis and disinformation campaigns online were very divisive for communities all around the world. You know, they have global impact now. And so, it, you know, the situation that we were thrown into with COVID probably created a greater sense of internal solidarity that I've seen in my generation. And that has been huge for us to be able to move forward. At the same time, I feel like the differences between movements have also been highlighted, because by this time in the year, before COVID, I will have gone to the Permanent Forum and engaged with my Indigenous brothers and sisters over there and kept up to date on their struggles. I will have engaged in a whole range of different spaces and been able to catch up with people and connect our struggles in the ways that we come together. And yes, we have Zoom, but you know, I haven't heard from my brothers, from my Xingu brothers and sisters in Brazil now since before COVID. And I know that, you know, digital access is an issue for groups around the world, and they don't have the infrastructure, or they are so severely oppressed in the situation that they're not able to take advantage of the technological privileges that we have to be able to build solidarity. So it's also for me really highlighted some of the gaps between our struggles and the different ways in which COVID has impacted, you know, some of our other, what do you call whānau, family members and different movements around the world as well. But it also, I mean, similar to climate change, it's a transnational issue that has its own descent of injustice that still ties into these kind of broader imperialist power relationships. I feel like those power relationships have just simply pivoted rather than grasping COVID as the opportunity for a new way of knowing, being, and doing and relating to each other. They're simply pivoted and still working to hold on to the interest, their own self-interest and privilege that they derive out of that system, and have simply made a calculation about how many people are disposable for them to be able to maintain that power system, and that's playing out around the world now, unfortunately. And again, it's communities of color, it's migrant communities, and it's Indigenous communities that are expected to pay the price in that formula.
Thank you. Thank you to on one hand to give us some hope, but on the other hand to critically reflect also how technology plays a role to, on one hand, to sustain privilege, but on the other hand, to see where it's not, where you can't have access and you're not getting in touch to each other. Michelle, how has the pandemic changed your work on a specific daily basis, but also in this transnational scope?
Yeah. Obviously, I think for everybody it's been a crazy period. It still is. And I can definitely follow the line of Tina, that it kind of forced people to think about, our collective well-being. However, what I found quite disturbing is it really highlighted the sense of individualism um, within, well, I can speak about the Netherlands, of course, so that's my context, but how difficult it has been for people to think and act, especially um, about others. That people equate, literally a few days ago, there was a so-called protest of people against the government policies, wearing what they call, people equating uh, COVID-19 regulations with oppression during colonialism and the Second World War. And when you equate not being allowed to go to a bar to drink a beer to racial oppression, I think then there's, something's going wrong. So that has been quite disturbing and still is. However, on the other hand, a very interesting development in my environment, and also for me personally, has been that the lockdowns have forced me and others to, literally take a step back. Because I think I've been listening a lot to podcasts and videos of people like Trisha Hershey. On Instagram, she calls herself the Nap Ministry, and sounds a bit funny. But she promotes the idea of rest as resistance. Because one of the pitfalls, I think, of being active in a movement is that, you can work 24/7. There are so many challenges, from climate change to racism to sexism to homophobia to the refugee issue. A lot of people lose themselves. I've seen it in my environment as well, people burning out, people getting depressed. And what she also argues that white supremacy and capitalism kind of urges you to continue to work, hustle, and things like that. And the lockdown really forced us to rethink what we value in life. So I've actually been thinking a lot about, okay, how can I continue to resist work, but also live a more balanced life? And still a challenge, but we're doing our best. And the third thing, I think we already touched upon it a bit, but definitely the Black Lives Matter movement in the summer of 2020. Because a year before, we had been organizing protests against Zwarte Piet, the blackface tradition, faced with a lot of resistance, neo-Nazis and the extreme right attacking us. And I think at the highest point we had about 800 or 900 people joining our protest. But the pandemic really forced people to, be still, actually feel what was going on, think about what was going on in the world, instead of being distracted by shopping, festivals, parties, and things like that, which led to the situation where all of a sudden thousands of people joined these protests. So, just like Tina said, it's benefits, but also its other side. But yeah, we try to build on the thing that went well. But we stay critical of the negative things.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I think it's also important that you looked at how these new resistance movements are kind of banalizing systems of oppression. And I think it's not just in the Netherlands. We're seeing this here as well
everywhere.
in Germany. It's turning upside down who is the victim, and now you have a new regime of victims, and you're like, wait a moment, that's a real virus. And so what is at stake here? So that's an interesting aspect also, how that affects then the social setting we're in. So Mohamad, the question also to you, wie hat die Pandemie die Arbeit verändert?
How did the pandemic change the work? We looked at this kind of like through the lens of technology.
direkt auf die Arbeit, aber auch noch mal
also like specifically to work, but then maybe again from like a migrant perspective and the challenges that you were able to see. Something that was really hard in the beginning is that people actually don't have the technical equipment, the setup, the hardware to be able to communicate through these technologies, also to have stable internet connections. Some preconditions, like some premises that need to be there, were not given. So that's the first problem. We first had to kind of like find resources to even give people the technical setup. That's a problem that we've dealt with for the past 1.5 years and actually still deal with. So let's say you work in kind of more of the rural areas, such as Sachsen-Anhalt. Certain areas, they actually don't have stable internet. The infrastructures are not as fast as we would need it to be. The second problem is, of course, like whatever format you might use, like Zoom. It, of course, has advantages, like everybody can kind of like join. So maybe we reach people who would have otherwise not come to such events. But they were able to come in live and participate. But they weren't there. At the same time, there's the question of like, how do you actually stay in contact? Because like personally, you can see people, you can exchange cards, you can do small talk. You can like kind of really see how you can help people. And in these other formats, it's actually quite difficult. There is no room to be really there where you're protected enough to be with each other. For online, in the beginning, big question, data security. How and why do you use it so it actually works? And I think protest and resistance really needs a safe or a safer space to happen. And I think online is quite hard to actually create that. I'm not sure if it's the space in terms of like safety that we actually need for resistance. Social contacts have also really decreased. People see each other less. You drift apart, you take distance, and it's really bad for resistance. Like, how are you supposed to get through the emotions through the digital space, through the screen? Some of the things just get lost. And I'm really afraid that through the pandemic, through the digital spaces, we cannot actually come closer to each other. The feeling, what unites us, sort of like the kid gets lost. Where's the emotionality for society? I think it fades away. Thank you so much. Ist noch gut? I think we continue here, right? I don't really...
Aber ich weiß, dass wir noch ein paar Minuten haben.
So we still have some minutes to go, even when there's like noise in the back and people are doing different things. And there's one question that I would like to ask for everybody, also for like finalizing this talking round, I guess. So here's my question. What needs to happen so that our singular fights, seen on a transnational level, can be connected better with each other? And you just said that especially during the pandemic, it's kind of hard to get in contact with each other. But what do you think would have to happen better? So here's what I think. I think we need to allow for people to meet in presence, to kind of like live with this pandemic, to come together even though it has influenced our lives so much, I feel like it made us absent in a way. I think we're very concentrated on the ideas of like, what are we allowed to do? What are we not allowed to do? So the pandemic, I think, needs to become part of our life a bit. A part is online, a part is here in presence. It is possible. I think we really need to kind of like go into the risks to find out that it's possible to move together in a space.
Michelle,
Okay, thank you.
what
Michelle,
do you think, what should happen to make more connections more possible?
what do you think should happen?
We can communicate, we might travel, we might meet each other, but I think establishing connections also in this perspective of resistance, that is a challenge. So what could be done better, or what is there what has shown you that worked very well?
Well, organize more of these kinds of meetings and conferences. Yeah, I really enjoy this conversation, even though it's partly digital and there's, there are all kinds of limitations. I do think this is a very interesting example of, creating these transnational connections. I think what we talked about earlier, education is essential. Yeah, of course, we are aware about these different struggles, but really going into conversation with each other and learning about each other's perspectives and struggles, such as now me learning from Tina, me learning from all of you, is very essential. So I think that a challenge for us is to to find the balance between these, digital or hybrid meetings with all of their its limitations. And I think we can also learn a lot from the past. That's why we are so happy with this archive. 50 years ago, when there was no Zoom or internet, there were already transnational connections. The Black Panther Party, I believe, even had a chapter in New Zealand. So what can we learn from them? And I think what is essential is recognizing our common struggle, what are the underlying struggles, the underlying structures which connect us instead of separate us, and build forward on that. And education is a very important part of it.
Thank you. Tina, I'm not sure where she can see me. Where is it? How do we see
Yeah.
each other? I see you here on the screen. So the question goes to you. So what should happen, or what do you think is important to connect or to build up the connections, but also to make the connections between the different struggles? What is this, what you want to share with us here?
Yeah, I would say one of and fantastic points. I'm really grateful for the points that both Michelle and Mahmud are raising, especially around the co-option of the language of the oppressed, and the importance we've really capitalized on when we can safely gather, remembering that actually the digital world, it's very easy to fall now more than ever to fall into the trap of thinking the digital world is everything, is our world now. But actually we there's a lot to be gained from taking back those spaces where we gather communally, because those are other spaces where we verify our truths with each other and create integrity with each other. That is a huge tool that we've found in combating misinformation and disinformation here in Aotearoa. So I just wanted to acknowledge some of those points that were raised. Looking into the future around, and even now around things that we can do to connect our struggles. So within the Indigenous struggle, well, within the Maori struggle, there are kind of other layers of experiencing the oppression as a Maori woman. And then, for instance, there are our whānau, the rainbow whānau, the queer whānau within Te Ao Māori, or we call them takatapui, our disabled whānau as well, and the movements that they have, the youth movements that sit within that, and that also sits at an international level. So there's the international youth movement, the international Indigenous youth movement, the international Indigenous women's movement, and making sure that I think it was a fantastic point Michelle made earlier around delinking and having, not, I don't like the word guerrilla, but, you know, loads of different spaces available for people to be able to express themselves and learn about their distinctive struggles on the ground, as opposed to always focusing on collective efforts. That requires also broad access to quality education about those struggles. And then also for those of us doing that, we need to make space for those movements within our struggles, for the women's movement to come through, for the youth in particular, who are very technologically savvy, as we know, but also have really innovative and vibrant and engaging ways of continuing the struggle as well. And then they connect with each other across movements. So our youth movements connect to the youth movements of other struggles, and that allows for a very organic and powerful kind of collaboration when we use those experiences within our movements to connect to other movements as well. Helps us to make ourselves better movements as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tina. These were really inspiring words in saying making space for the youth movements. We have only few minutes, and I think this time I won't pose you another questions because we're running out of time. But it was a really wonderful panel, and ein großes Dankeschön an euch alle. Ich bin froh, dass die Technik halbwegs gut geklappt hat.
Thank you very much to all of you. We're glad that the technical things worked well, kind of. And we're happy to have had this discussion about transnational resistance. Thank you for waking up.
For coming from Amsterdam to Berlin. Vielen Dank an Mohamad, dass du nicht ganz so weit reisen musstest, um hierher zu kommen, aber hierher gekommen bist. Ich danke NDO.
Thank you, Ahmad, for coming here, and thank you, NDO, and thank you, Fatma. We cannot see her right now, but I hope she could at least follow the discussion online. Would have loved to have her with us here. We want to thank NDO again for this wonderful panel. And we had this really nice production, TV production with makeup and everything. So, and I'm happy that we can stay here a little bit longer. And goodbye to the audience out there, to everyone. And next up is Tarek.
So what are those final words for this first day of the 6th National Congress of NDO? But it's not over yet. I think I've teased this before. From 7 on, there is nice Abendshow. What happens exactly, I'll tell you in a second. But so far, I'd just like to say thank you. Thank you to the people watching and who will continue watching at the nice evening show. Thank you so much to all the speakers, the panelists. Thank you for those who made the edits possible.
Ja, mehr geht nicht an das NDO-Team.
Thank you to the world's best, to those who can't even top it anymore, the NDO team, and Fatma, of course. Thank you, Tarek. That was amazing with you today. Thank you so much. A great day is coming to its end. Thank you so much from our team. An event like this needs so much help in terms of like the hands helping, the money helping, the people thinking about it. We'd like to very heartfully thank BIPoC, Mercator Foundation, all the people, board members from our council, And those very few, the many people who go giving out the technical support right now, who even make this possible, that we can go out there to the digital space. Thank you so much to Mo. Thank you to friends, to Mura and friends, the people who are behind the sound, behind the images, also to the directors and all the people of NDO who have been working here to make this possible.